So for those of you that don't know the difference between biological medicines and biosimilar medicines, let me kind of briefly explain. When you take a normal small tablet of medicine, that's generally called a small molecule. It's synthesized in a typical organic chemistry laboratory. A biologic is more like a protein. It's the same kind of proteins that you have in your body. They are extremely large and complicated molecules, and they take a lot to make, and they take certainly a lot to figure out how to get approval for, in the drug approval process. So why are biologics important? There are so many disease conditions nowadays that can be treated with biologics as opposed to small molecules. With most biologics, they are injected into your body. Therefore, the medicine can get directly into the bloodstream and take care of the disease condition. Biologics can take the form of monoclonal antibodies, cytokines, or fusion proteins. They are large chemical compounds that go right after the cell. So for example, in a cancer cell, you can take a small molecule medicine that you would ingest. It would have to go through your stomach, go through the bloodstream, through the liver, and then ultimately get delivered to the target organ or the cancer cell where it could act. With a biologic, they can inject it through an IV or through other type of self-injection, and then at that point in time, it would be reaching the disease condition or the disease cells. So how have we come here? Traditionally, most medicine in the United States have been the small molecules. It wasn't until 2005 that the first biosimilar was approved in Europe. Now, why did that take place? Because of the complexity of biosimilars and the complexity of biologic medicines, the approval pathway was difficult. It was difficult to understand where, how, and when, and what kind of testing people should do in order to get a biosimilar or a biological drug approved. So when you think about it, is that a small molecule will work in the same way because it is easily identifiable. With a biologic, it's complicated. The proteins will fold upon themselves. So there's a three-dimensional structure. Imagine that you have a key that you need to put it into a lock. And imagine if that key was not just a flat key, but it also had all sorts of different side chains to that. You'd have to design the lock and the key in such a way that it works. As a consequence of the regulatory pathway to get FDA approvals for biologics on the brand side, they're complicated, and as a consequence, they're costly. It can take hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a biological medicine and then commit to all the testing that needs to get done. Now, biosimilars are also not cheap. Branded pharmaceutical biological products can range anywhere from hundreds of dollars per administration to hundreds of thousands of dollars per administration. Some of the biggest selling drugs in America are in fact biologics, such as AbbVie's Humira, which is used for Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis. It is more than a $10 billion a year drug. Because the nature of generic industries or generic companies come along and they would like to make copies and provide, cheaper versions of the form of the drug. As a consequence of that, generic companies have classically looked at small molecules, small molecules from branded companies, and then say, what can they do to make generic copies? In making a generic copy of a branded drug, they take the branded drug, they do some testing on it, and they figure out how does it work, how fast the tablet will dissolve in a liquid. And then the generic company comes along and they show that their drug prototype will operate in the same way. The generic drug company doesn't have to do the same type of clinical testing for safety and efficacy that the brand company originally did. They know it works. So if I'm making a generic copy of ibuprofen or a generic copy of some type of penicillin, all I have to show in my prototype is that my prototype drug, when administered to a patient, will operate in the same way and exhibit the same type of behavioral characteristics that the branded drug does. Now, up until 2012, there was no pathway to approve a biosimilar. So in the same way that there were biological drugs that were approved as the original branded drugs, there's no mechanism or no pathway for biosimilars to be approved in the United States. The European Union started on its biosimilar regulatory pathway earlier than the United States. The United States passed then what was called the BPCIA. And the BPCIA was passed as part of the Affordable Health Care Act. When the Affordable Health Care Act was promulgated, it got caught up in the court systems in the United States up until the time that the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the ACA, the Affordable Health Care Act, or also called Obamacare, was legit. And then because it was legit, the FDA decided to create the biosimilar pathway. So the United States FDA is actually behind the biosimilar pathways than other countries. Now, as a consequence of that, Europe has gotten a lot more education and a lot more buy-in on biosimilars. Their pathway, as most pathways, require the biosimilar applicant to do high levels of characterization and qualification studies. They need to know about the method of synthesis because it's a complicated molecule. They're going to want to ensure that it really does work in the same way as the biosimilar brand, the branded product, and make sure that it works in the same way. In addition, there are a lot more controls on manufacturing, the routes of synthesis, any immunogenicity studies that might be taken. And as a consequence of that, the whole goal of a biosimilar program, whether you're in Europe, India, Canada, or United States, is to assure that in the same way a typical small molecule generic will be therapeutically effective for the brand company, the regulators want to ensure that the biosimilar is going to have the same levels of safety and efficacy as the brand companies. As a consequence of that, for the generic drug industry, embarking on a biosimilar program is not cheap. It's going to cost tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to develop generic versions of biologic drugs, so-called biosimilars. And in addition, they're going to encounter the same types of issues that they've incurred in the small molecule world. First thing they're going to experience is what's the regulatory pathway? That regulatory pathway is a moving, ever-evolving pathway. So the generic companies are going to work with the FDA to ensure that their biosimilar development program is working in the same way that it should be working, and that there's not too many undue burdens that are being done. Secondly, the next thing that's going to happen is they're going to be looking at the same level of intellectual property protection. In the same way brand companies protect their small molecules and their branded products, the brand companies here are going to be protecting the same levels of the branded biologics with patents. And so we begin to experience the same level of issues with the patent law aspects. So unlike in the traditional Hatch-Waxman paragraph 4 space, where the paragraph 4 space where the patents are in a book, they're listed, there's certifications that are done. In the biologics, there are not. A generic company wanting to understand what are the relevant patents that may be implicated by a biosimilar development program, they will in fact have to search for those patents. And in fact, those patents are not anywhere, easily to be found. You have to find them, decide whether you're going to respect the patent, design around the patent, wait for that patent to expire. As a consequence, biosimilars face a huge patent challenge because there are dozens, if not hundreds of patents protecting the branded biologic. So for example, in the same way that you could have a compound patent on the compound of the small molecule medicine, you could have patents on the amino acid sequence. In the same way you could have certain formulation patents that protect the branded small molecule product, you could have formulation patent issues. In addition, you could have patents that are related to the methods of use. You could have patents that are related to the route of synthesis, impurity profile, the cell culture, media, you name it. All of those patents can be asserted against a biosimilar, when that biosimilar is doing its development and then ultimately when it chooses to launch. So as a consequence of this patent uncertainty, part of the Affordable Health Care Act and the BPCIA promulgated this so-called patent dance, as we now know it in the United States. Initially, there were some real early questions as to how this patent dance would work. How would this exchange of patent information, where the generic biologic company could ask the brand company, what patents do you have? If I were to launch my biosimilar product, what patents will you sue me on? And then the brand company would respond with either nothing, they're not going to tell you what patents that they own. But under the BPCIA, there is now a more formal process involved where generic companies can identify their list of patents. They can send that notice to the brand company, and the brand company is obligated to respond and identify its list of patents. And it's this exchange that we call the dance. Now, initially, we weren't sure of some of the rules of the dance. So, for example, was a biosimilar applicant required to even participate in the patent exchange? Once they participated in the patent exchange, did they have to go through the full process of the patent exchange? Could they drop out at any time? And now we're in a position in which we now have more clarity of those rules. But the patent thicket still exists. So for example, in Humira, a lot of people are concerned that AbbVie has more than 150 to 200 patents in addition to the basic patents that cover Humira. Some people have alleged that those many patents are too many. Now, one could raise the question fairly, how many is a company supposed to have? How many is an appropriate amount? Has AbbVie done anything wrong? And there are some people who claim that AbbVie has engaged in antitrust conspiracies or antitrust violations by obtaining that many patents. And so it's going to remain to be seen how that plays out and whether these brand companies will become more selective in the patents that they obtain in the first place, or if they have an arsenal of patents, which patents they will take out and assert against the other biosimilar applicants. The new area that a lot of biosimilar applicants are looking at right now in the US FDA, they have approved about 26 biologics or biosimilars, of which 14 of them have launched in the United States. And there's some mixed results as to how their marketing has actually gone. Have these biosimilars who have launched been successful in the marketplace? And so it depends on the molecule, it depends on the disease condition, but the statistics are showing that there's some benefit to biosimilars in certain areas, and in some areas they haven't shown the biosimilars have done a very good job in market penetration and or reducing the price of the overall drugs.